Welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast, where lived experience meets real conversation. We shine a light on the stories that need to be heard, with honest and inspiring conversations with people with dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and autism. The Dear Dyslexic podcast is more than just a show. It's a community, a space for connection, and a movement to rethink dyslexia. Subscribe today and join us on our journey, one story at a time. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dear Dyslexic podcast show. Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Ben Walkenhorst. I think I just said that completely wrong, didn't I, Ben?
You can pronounce it Walkenhorst or
Oh, good.
Walkenhorst.
I know we just practiced that before we came on. And Ben is going to be talking to us today around psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Ben's currently got his own consulting company and with BW Communications. And so today we're going to be talking about lots of different things around how to keep workplaces safe psychologically, where we're not feeling vulnerable, where we can be our authentic selves. And Ben has a huge range of experience leading small to very, very, very large teams. And he's come to share with us today his wisdom and his lived experience. So thank you for coming on the show today, Ben.
Thanks, Dr. Shae. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please, I think we've just Shae's fine. Though if my daughter was here, she'd say, why don't people call you Dr. Shae? So we have been working on a separate project around, you've been helping us create some videos around psychosocial hazards in the workplace for neurodivergent people. And I feel like it's a bit of a new term, particularly because it's become regulated in some states and it's now mandated under the Code of Practice for Work Health and Safety. And so I was wondering if you could unpack what these terms even mean to start with before we then say, well, how does this impact us and what strategies help? And before that, even a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, let me start there. So my name is Ben Walkenhorst and I'm pleased to be here. I have over 20 years experience, 15 in leadership. I'm a brand, business, product and people builder and a behavioural change marketer. That experience, Shae, has been across government, private and not-for-profit in the finance, retail, tech and education sectors. Largely, I've managed people, as you mentioned, from very small teams of one or two to workforces as large as 200 with direct reports of about 10 to 12. Now, those workforces have been very mixed and varied. People have come from neurodiverse backgrounds, from torture trauma backgrounds, from culturally and linguistically diverse or non-English speaking backgrounds, from being diagnosed or undiagnosed with mental health or physical disabilities. And they have spanned a large age group or generation. We're now working in a workforce which has 5 generations in it. So I've led people as young as 16 and as old as 65 from multidisciplinary and cross-functional backgrounds. And I have dyslexia myself. Might be struggling to get that out, having dyslexia. But I wear these Irlen lenses, otherwise known as rose-coloured glasses, and they filter out a certain light rays that the eyes are allergic to, which helps me to see and helps correct the dyslexia in most cases for me. I'm really pleased to be here today. Shae, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And I'll come back to that big question I started with my brain racing before really even introducing you properly. But before we really look at unpacking psychosocial hazards in the workplace, tell us a little bit more about your story about growing up. When were you diagnosed with dyslexia? You just said then the glasses really help, but are there other things you struggle with? Because I know dyslexia is more than just our reading on the paper. So could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, look, I was first diagnosed in about year 5. So I went through early childhood really struggling. My mother and father were really terrific in providing support in the home. But in the 70s and 80s, really the education system didn't understand dyslexia or learning difficulties or a range of disabilities, to be frank. And my parents really understood that, gee, Ben's a smart kid, but why is he struggling academically in the classroom? And after many consultations with educators and facilitators of learning, otherwise known as teachers, they really came up against a lot of resistance. I know Ben's just not trying hard enough. No, he's just not concentrating in class. He's easily distracted. But really, what was going on is I was having trouble hearing where sounds were coming from because my dyslexia has an auditory component to it. I was also having trouble with understanding what I was reading and seeing, and that affected my writing ability as well. So, the symptoms for me would be words swimming on the page, fogginess on the page, blurred vision, sounds, not understanding where the sound was coming from with the teacher speaking, and particularly in loud and noisy rooms. So after a number of different things, seeing optometrists, seeing medical doctors, trying alternative medicine practices, back then my mother had heard about Irlen lenses, and that there was a diagnostician. We were 5 hours from Melbourne in a small rural town called Horsham in Western Victoria. So there weren't a lot of services available to us. And this diagnostician, I believe, was traveling from Melbourne to come down, and she actually spent 5 hours with me running through different colors in front of my eyes from different lenses to work out which colors worked for me best, which colors in the white light spectrum affected my sight. So it's a form of dyslexia, and it's now backed by the Irlen Dyslexia Association of Australia. I've been wearing these lenses for 30 years in Australia. Unfortunately, they're not on a lot of the healthcare systems or schedules at the moment. But for me, they worked, and I went from being a flunking student to essentially an A grade student overnight. I went on to study at university, and I now have a swag of certifications, qualifications, including GAICD with the Australian Institute of Company Directors.
Wow. And I know that this is going to cause some controversy around glasses. when so when we talk about Irwin syndrome, we usually separate the two out between dyslexia and Irwin syndrome. What are your thoughts around that? As two different conditions.
Yeah, look, I don't particularly take a view on it, Shae. My view is that these glasses have significantly assisted me. There are a number of things that I've built into my work life and into my life to ensure that I overcome some of the challenges, and I'll talk to those shortly, such as environmental factors, such as process factors, such as procedural factors. But I really don't buy into those discussions or arguments for myself, simply because I know that these work for me.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you say that because when we first started doing this work, we weren't really hearing a lot, and we still don't hear a lot of adult voices in Australia. And so there's a lot of pushback on the different things that do help adults. And for some adults, it is changing the background colors, or it is wearing glasses, or it is doing a variety of things that might not, you might not see in mainstream schools, or that have a certain evidence base behind it. And I think as we progress into adulthood, it's what works best for us, whether that's evidence base behind it or not. And so I think that's really important because otherwise we can get caught up in these technical conversations when really at the end of the day, we just want people to be able to succeed with whatever strategies work.
Agree.
So moving on then to strategies, what um, what are some of the things that have helped you, and then we will transition into what you've seen help people, and then what makes psychosocial safety in the workplace. I think we've gone about it in a different way than when I'd started, but let's try that way first.
Let's try that way first. Well, look, for me and the teams that I've led, what works best is understanding your condition, understanding what works well for you, understanding your team. So, in my work life and experience, I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of personnel and management training with large financial institutions or superannuation institutions. I've undertaken both for myself and my teams Gartner testing, Myers-Briggs testing, Clifton Gallup strengths testing, and also emotional intelligence testing. And so I think with understanding yourself better, understanding your teams better, understanding how people communicate, work together, and how they think, helps you as a leader then to have conversations with people about what are their needs and to set up what I call psychologically safe work environments. So, what I tend to do when I talk about strategies for myself and my team is look at reinforcing positive messaging and positive behaviors for great leadership so that you're creating an environment where people can speak up and feel safe psychologically to speak up and have conversations. So, what are some of the things that I do? I talk about myself and my own situation, which then gives people permission to talk about their situation. And the natural behavior for people in building rapport is to self disclose. Now, if you have a psychologically safe environment where you have created an environment of no judgment, no bullying or toxic behavior, of acceptance and inclusion, then people will feel safer in order to speak up and have those conversations. And I believe it's incumbent on leadership to create that environment or know how to create that environment through training in the workforce.
And so when you think about those words, psychosocial hazards in the workplace or creating psychologically safe environments, what do they mean for you?
Yeah, a great question, Shae. And I suppose we'll take a step back to what are the key factors of creating a psychologically safe environment. And there are a number, and of course you can Google it or look it up on AI, ChatGPT. But for me, over my experience, I would say that there are three key factors of creating a psychologically safe environment for neurodiverse people or people with dyslexia. The first is great leadership. The second is job design and job demand. And the three is environmental factors. So let's unpack some of those, what they mean, and then perhaps talk to some specific examples that I've seen in the workforce about how we can address those things.
And
So for me, in great leadership, it's about having consistent communication. It's about disabling toxic and bullying environments. So, creating environments in the workplace where we come together as a team to make decisions collaboratively and not judgments. So, for example, I was working in a large superannuation organisation during COVID, managing a team of 8 completely remotely. And before we would start our online meetings, we would have the usual chit chat, warming up, get to know you. And often, what would come into those conversations was the latest television program that we might be watching. And at the time, there was one on married. I'm not going to marriage, and I'm not going to say the brand name here. But I think we all know that one. And it became a little bit of a judgmental conversation about that. Now, as a leader, whilst that was a social conversation, I felt it my responsibility to say, hey, we're not here to judge or let me say, bitch about people. We're here to talk about positive experiences. So, what's some of the positive experiences we've had this week? And I think that then sets a tone as a leader of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable by creating an environment that is non judgmental and that we're coming here today to talk about decisions. So, one of the other things that I did there too was to ensure that all of our meetings weren't just task focused, that we actually came together as a group online during COVID socially and set up, an online breakfast club, an online coffee club, where we'd actually drop in and imaginally buy our coffee for the morning before heading into work, where we could have those social gathering moments and reinforce those messages of a positively safe psychological environment. So,
So, sorry to stop you there for a minute, Ben. Can you just explain what those words mean in case people haven't heard them yet?
yeah, so for me, a psychologically safe environment is one where people feel safe to speak up, where there won't be any retaliation, there won't be any judgment, they won't be shut down, where they feel comfortable in having hard conversations, difficult conversations, and speaking about what their needs are, regardless of whether they're workplace needs or personal needs.
Thank you. Just in case people have heard the term, but they weren't quite sure. And even though we're doing a whole heap of work on it, none of that's out yet. This will be our taster. So thank you for just explaining that, just in case people were wondering and they hadn't Googled because they were too busy listening to you. So sorry. So you were talking about, and that was a really great example of the coffee and coming together to have a chat. So what else have you seen that's worked well while you've been in leadership roles or
Yeah,
continue to
look,
be?
I think that's the second part that I was talking about is job design and job demand. And a really great example there. And what I mean by that is really it's upon leadership to manage excessive workflow and emotional demands on the workforce. Now, yes, we work in a fast-paced environment, an ever-changing environment. It's more fluid than ever before. There is more information than ever before. In marketing terms, we would say that we have over 1 million stimuli around brand messaging throughout the day. Um, there is now research out from universities to say, and I believe it was Cambridge, to say that the teenage brain, in terms of adult development, has 5 stages: 0 to 9, 9 to 33, 33 to 56, and 56 to 83, I believe, from memory. And that teenage year has grown from 9 to 25 and is the biggest, or adolescent year is the biggest year, now spanning into our 30s because of the information overload on people. So it's really important that as leaders we understand that and we manage it for our teams. One of the examples that I'd like to speak to is having worked with local government. And I think that there's a perception that in government or large organizations, you've got time and resources. But regardless of whether you're in a small business or a scale up business or a mid sized business, I think if you take the time to understand your team, understand how they communicate, whether they're auditory, verbal, how they think, whether they're scientific brains, whether they're directed brains, whether they're people that come together and rally the team, whether they are client based people. Understanding how teams interact and communicate well is just best practice, not just only for neurodiverse people or people with dyslexia. So when I worked for this local council, my role there, or the remit, was to review and audit and update the public infringement appeals process. And that required working with local laws officers out on the street. That required working with a telecommunications or a telemarketing team, a customer service team of about 20. That required working with a frontline reception team of about 13, as well as a leadership team. And so I actually said to the leaders, first thing that I will do is actually nothing. I want to spend time with each of these teams and get to know what their workflow is, what their work processes are, and who they are as individuals and as a team. So don't expect any results from me for 3 months. Now, as a small scale up, you might, or a small business, you might have to readjust your expectations around what will work in your business. But for local council, that worked well. So we had workshops, we had town halls, we had forums, we had meetings whereby I got to know all of the teams. I undertook some behavioral studies into the teams and some surveys and some questions, both qualitative and quantitative, as well as face to face interviews and informal interviews. Then I was able to gather all of that information. We talked about job design and job process and what would make the jobs better in terms of automation, in terms of communication, in terms of procedure and structure. And each of these teams had input into the process or had representatives providing and channeling feedback into a pool of information. And then as a leadership team, we came together and worked out what information was going to work for the business and what job redesign would work and what wouldn't work. And then we clearly communicated our actionable items back to the workforce about that, which was critical to say, this is what we've heard from you, this is what we're taking on board, and this is what we're not taking on board, and these are the reasons for both. And then providing avenues for communication and channel and feedback to redesign that process. So it was iterative, as we would say in the tech world, it wasn't waterfall. And then we would pilot those changes and then we would re-engineer those changes to see, was that actually really working in practice for the teams. And so in summary, what we did, Shae, was review the appeals process from 23 manually written processes and letters down to 11 automated systems.
Wow, that's amazing. And so throughout that journey, do you think by doing it iteratively and by being so inclusive, it sounds like by from everyone within those different teams, that in itself was a way of creating that psychological safety because everyone was involved, everyone had input, it was a pilot, so you could go back and forth and trial and test, and no one was wrong, no one was right. It was developing in time.
Absolutely. And, key to that was establishing the environmental factors and the psychosocial factors around how we would engage. So, establishing at the top of each meeting how we would communicate with each other, how we would respect each other, what was expected during the meeting in terms of outcomes, what was expected in terms of the way we would collaboratively engage with one another. What were the aims and what were importantly, using De Bono's 6 hats, what were the emotions that people were feeling? How did they feel going into the process? How did they feel during the process? And how did they feel at the end of the process? Really critical to marry those things together in my mind for the success of the program.
And so before we go on to what we generally see for neurodivergent people, what you had one more key factor that we wanted to share?
Yeah, which was a really good segue into how does it work for neurodiverse people, and that is the environmental factors. So, really, again, people from neurodiverse backgrounds may or may not be diagnosed, and as a leader, it's your responsibility or the organizer's responsibility to empower and train you to identify what the needs are of your workforce or to set up environments where people feel safe to have those conversations with you. So, again, what I do is I talk about my own experience, which opens the door for people. I often will have conversations with people outside the workplace. Let's go for a coffee, let's go for a walk around the park. Tell me what you need from your job. Tell me what you need from me, and tell me how we can achieve that together. And calling out that this is a safe environment. What we discuss here today will be kept confidential if you would like it to be kept confidential. So some of the things that work for me and that work for my team is to ensure that the lighting is appropriate, to ensure that the sound is appropriate, to ensure that there aren't triggers around smell and possibly even taste in the work environment, and to call out those things. For myself, I like to change the color of my screen in Microsoft Word so that I'm not looking at a glaringly white screen. I have indirect lighting around me all the time rather than fluorescent lighting. It's not always been the case. It can change a lot of environmental factors in the workforce, but as a leader, you would want to be able to have some influence over that for your workforce. And now that we work in an environment where work is a time, not necessarily a place, we would instill things like what I call adult to adult relationships. So there's no set times to start and finish work in contracts. You and I are both working from home offices at the moment. So there may be anchor days at which people go into a workplace, which I think it's really important. As an environmental factor for people from neurodiverse backgrounds, they need that stimulation often of being around other people and that challenge of being around other people. Isolation can be a challenge, but at the same time, it can be too overwhelming for some people from neurodiverse backgrounds to have a lot of stimulation around them. So it's about having the conversation with people, what works for them.
So, from a neurodivergent perspective, because everyone's at risk of having a psychologically unsafe work environment, um, and I mean, which is why they brought all the new guidelines and mandates in at the moment. But what do you see are the differentiating points for neurodivergent people? And so I did my thesis on the job demands resource model of burnout and looking at it from a dyslexic perspective. But from your perspective as a leader, what have you seen that can be trip hazards? I mean, we've just talked about the
Mm.
environment, but are there other has there ever been a situation for you where you've been at work and you felt vulnerable or unsafe because of your dyslexia and you didn't want to talk about it, or you were made to feel a certain way because of it? Because I've got lots of stories I could share, but I want to hear from you.
Well, look, there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention. First, around job demand and clarity of job role, and then an example of working and leading a person who disclosed a diagnosis of autism to me. And so the first thing is around job role and job description. It's really important often for people with neurodivergent backgrounds that they have clear, defined guardrails around what are the expectations in their position description and job role. And if that is going to change, and it may need to on a day to day basis, the role may be flexible, that there is a conversation had with them about that changing expectation and that job role, and that is come to in an agreed manner so that they don't feel like, oh, I've applied for this job, I've accepted this job, but it's actually shifted your expectations and change, and it's outside of my ability, or I feel like I'm overwhelmed by that change. I probably can handle that change, but I will need to handle that changing incrementally. And I think it's incumbent on the leader to have that conversation and to work through that job design. Now, in a small business or a scale up, even in large businesses, the job can change frequently. The job demand can change frequently. There may be, for example, in a large financial institutions, you may have a team where you have internal stakeholders. In a workforce of 55,000, you might have 150 to 200 different stakeholders, and you may be requiring people with neurodiverse backgrounds to be part of teams that are supporting those internal stakeholders. So, what supports do they need outside of environmental factors? But are there psychologically psychological support, such as EAP programs? Are there AI programs? Are there technical programs that can assist them that they would require, or that you could talk to them about using that will help them in their workplace? The example that I'd like to talk to in managing an autistic person who disclosed to me that they had autism, it was very clear to me with my experience that they were presenting with factors or indicators of autism. In my personal life, I'd had also dated someone with autism, so it was glaringly obvious to me. Um, what I found is that they had been seated in an open plan office, um, and near an entry exit doorway, both outside to a balcony where people would go out and socialize or have lunch, and also in a hallway that would enter into the open workspace area. Now, they enjoyed being part of that environment because there was lots of stimulation for them, and part of their autism was ADHD as well. And so for them, there was something always going on that was stimulating them. As a leader, what I was finding is their work was being impacted in the sense that they were not completing tasks, they were not meeting deadlines, and they were also in completing a task, not going through all the steps that were required in meeting that task. So, for example, organizing for marketing collateral to be sent for a conference, ordering the couriers, checking on the status of the couriers and the delivery of the materials wasn't for taking place in a systematic way to ensure the goods got from point A to point B. And in some cases, we didn't even get the materials to the conference for our sales team at the exhibition stands. So it was critical for me to identify that, have a conversation, and I suggested that we move the team, the whole team, not just the person with autism, into my office, which was secluded in a leadership area, and I was happy to go and sit out in the open plan office area.
And so, how did that work? Because in a lot of ways, because when we run training, we get this question all the time: what is a reasonable adjustment? And what becomes unreasonable? And how do you identify when it's a neurodivergent something because of their neurodivergence, where they're not meeting expectations because of the example here around the environment, um, versus you've done all those adjustments, but they're still not meeting expectation. Like, how have you worked through that in the past? Is that did I make myself clear then?
Yeah, I think if I relay the question, it's about, well, one, how do you not single out one person or group of peoples around neurodivergence? And then if you do make those adjustments and there is no change, how do you manage through that? So the first thing that I would say, as I said earlier, I think a lot of what we're talking about is, whilst it's a new discussion around neurodivergence in the workplace, it reminds me of the conversations around bullying, around sexual harassment, around gender identity, around sexual orientation. They're now part of the course when it comes to best practice employee management of employees. I think that what we're talking about today, whilst it is new to the workforce, is really about best practice. So it's about engaging the whole workforce, not calling out a single person, but as a leader, being aware of the needs of neurodiverse people, having one-on-one confidential conversations, and so that you can take those insights into the broader team discussion about the wider redesign or redesign of either environmental factors or job descriptions, so that you can talk as a team rather than individuals, or you can talk about roles rather than individuals. How do you manage that then? Your typical leadership, people management principles, have clear, open discussions, set reasonable expectations, have a lead with agreement and consensus rather than a dictatorial top-down approach, have regular work in progress meetings, regular check in meetings, day to day, week to week, month to month, whatever frequency works for you and the organization, so that people are not blindsided by your expectations as a leader or the organization's expectations not being met. And of course, having KPIs in place, which is critical to laddering up to the corporate plan and corporate strategy.
And so, when you think about neurodivergence, then, and putting some of those additional strategies in place. Sorry, I have to pause because I had a really important point and I was going to ask you as you were talking.
Well, let me go on
So,
to talk about a question that you asked of for me, and how have things impacted me in the workplace. So I would say that I have built into my workplace and my work practices extra time. So I need extra time to be able to proofread. I need extra time to be able to use spell checkers and grammar checkers, and I now put most things through ChatGPT or Claude, as in AI, to assist me, so that when leaders come to me, or internal or clients come to me, either internally or through my consultancy, and say this is the timeline and the deadline that we are setting, I then will have, as in most workplaces, a conversation about meeting those deadlines and what's realistic, building into that the factors of what I need and what my teams need in order to meet those deadlines. Now, if those deadlines are not achievable given the time restraints that we require in terms of getting our work done in an appropriate fashion, so that it is perfect, or as good as perfect can be before going out publicly or to the client, um, then we will have a discussion about what needs to be dropped off. So that comes to my point earlier about managing emotional and excessive job demand. As a leader, that's your responsibility.
when you were talking about giving feedback, or when you've gotten feedback in the past, we're often asked now around particularly with people with ADHD or ADHD and autism, around rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria. I don't know if that was a term that you've heard of. It's used a lot now. So when people are getting feedback, sometimes they misconstrued it, or well, misconstrued is not the right word, but for them, it might be extra sensitive, or it feels a lot more critical to them than the manager giving that feedback. And like for an example, when I not that I have rejection sensitivity dysphoria, but when I'm given papers and they're covered in red marks from my manager, and then it's like talked about in an open planned office how it was not very well put together, there's lots of mistakes, blah, blah, blah. Because of my trauma of school, then my response could appear to be overreacting or aggressive or rude, or I'm so emotional because I couldn't take that feedback. So we hear when we're working that sometimes giving that constant feedback can make people feel even more insecure or uncertain about themselves because of their neurodivergence. Have you come across that in the past?
Yeah, it's a really good point. That I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you talked about there. One about how feedback is given, and then one about how I have come up with giving or asking or checking in a lot. Now, I've had this both in my personal life and in my work environment. So I think it comes back to my first point about great leadership. So great leadership will not be giving feedback in an open plan environment and singling out people. To me, that's not great leadership. Great leadership will be saying to people, how I mark up documents, whether it be in track changes or not. This is how it works for me. And the system comes up in red pen. Is that a trigger? I know it seems a bit. I've actually said to people, I use red pen because it shows up well on the paper for me, but I can use green pen. Is that a trigger for you? I know that it's a trigger for me. The word processor uses red in terms of its
Default.
track changes. Do you want me to change the color? for you, and I think as a leader, having those informal, quick conversations about how you proofread and make edits to things on a one-to-one basis, or perhaps with the team, it might be in a team meeting when you're talking about a peer-to-peer review process, that it's a 360-degree process. It's not about judging. It's about helping each other. It's about catching each other. It's about having each other's back. It's not about calling out mistakes. Even though that might be part of the process, it's about making sure that everyone is felt supported and we have each other's backs. So for me, that's the first thing to your point about great leadership and how to give feedback. And I'm changing in workforce. Recently, I worked with Libby O'Loughlin, who's a great consultant based out of the NT who works a lot on personality when working with teams. And Libby O says, right, let's change the word from feedback to advice. Let's to ask people for their advice because they're experts and we're all adults. Secondly, I would say let's check in and keep catch an environment, particularly for neurodiverse people. I have known by constantly and witness by constantly checking in with people can increase anxiety levels. So ask, and you can see people fidget, you can see them sweat. And it might not just be people from neurodiverse backgrounds, it might be anyone, and you don't necessarily know what the triggers are. For me, checking in is important to understand, have I set the environment right for people? However, when I notice, and it's active listening, so looking at all the psychosocial cues and environmental cues and physical cues, uh, and when I notice those changing, saying, look, I'm setting an environment of safety here. There's no wrong answers, but you tell me how you would like things to be. So, for example, in my personal life, I mentioned earlier that I dated someone with autism. At the beginning, I would check in with them very frequently. Is the sound okay in here? Is the temperature okay? Is the lighting okay? And it would actually increase their anxiety levels. So I've said, I then found a place to say, you make yourself at home and you tell me, you have permission to tell me when things are not working for you. And that's okay.
And that's a nice way to be working in a work environment, isn't it? As a manager, you tell me when things are not working rather than us always telling people when it's not working for us.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's that one of the factors I call adult to adult relationships. Okay, there are different levels of stages of growth and stages of brain development, and as a leader, you need to understand those and be able to reach people in those levels. But again, it's about setting an environment where people feel safe to have conversations with you, where they can then say, this is working for me, this isn't working for me, these are the things that I need to do, without fear of retribution. For example, wearing headphones like you're wearing today.
Which I hate.
Um,
Can't get my Bluetooth to work.
which might be okay. I remember working in a work environment where there was a policy that you couldn't wear
Mm,
your
yeah,
earbuds in the
yeah.
workplace. And and look, there may be environments where that is a safety hazard.
Mm,
So on a factory floor, for example.
yeah. Or on the tools.
However, it then becomes down to, how do you create the environment that is appropriate for the environment that your people are working in?
So, how important do you think training is? Because you were talking about the trigger of the red pen, and you might do that instinctively because you're dyslexic, and you know that red pen may be a trigger for somebody. And so you're doing all these things naturally, partly because of your neurodivergence, partly because you're an amazing leader and you've done all this additional training. So, where do you see a gap at at the moment around leadership's understanding of neurodivergence, and where do you think the training needs to come in so that it's a bit more intuitive, or that there's more thought put in, like we were talking about with the pen? because not everyone's going to think that red pen is a trigger.
That's true. Look, I suppose I'm biased in the sense of my experiences in life and my training in life. I've been fortunate to have a lot of experience and a lot of training. I would answer that question by saying you don't know what you don't know, and education helps you understand better some cases that you don't know much at all, but it helps you understand more. And I think it's incumbent, it's critical, it's important for organisations and senior leadership to ensure that their people leaders are well trained, well versed in managing people. And it's probably the hardest thing in the workplace to do is to manage people because you may have all of the models and frameworks, but every person is different and no there is no set rule, but there are general guidelines and guardrails. And I think if you understand how people function psychologically, socially, and emotionally, you understand how your teams work in terms of group think, you understand what is a fixed mindset and what is a growth mindset, and then what you understand about the neurodiverse symptoms or diagnoses and how best to manage them makes you not only a better person, but a better leader. And at the end of the day, designing better commercial outcomes for the organization. So productivity is higher, engagement and satisfaction of employees and customers is higher. So your NPS score and your employment as employee satisfaction scores are higher. Therefore, your bottom line revenue, profit, and margins are going to be better.
And it's funny you say that. It's a nice way for us to start to wrap up because often we get asked by the finance person or someone in exec sitting in the back row, but how does this help us make money?
Yeah, well, look, I saw a great uh, diagram about change management in the workforce, which I have to send to you. But essentially, it said we need to get a project manager in or a behavioural change scientist in to redesign this change. Oh, the existing project manager can do it. Then there's a time frame of which the project manager does it, and oh shit, we actually need the professional in to do it. And oh shit, it's actually cost us more time and money than what we expected by having an initial outlay of having the training or the professional in, or actually making the time at the beginning of the process. So I would say that your bottom line is affected by not doing it properly in the first place.
And so, for those listening out there who might have thought it was a nice to have or nice to do, we're really hopefully this conversation's shifting that to it's not a nice ticker box. It's actually works for everybody in many, many positive ways financially, emotionally, psychologically, the whole circle.
Well, and now legislatively as well.
Yes.
So there are legislation and regulation that are moving towards similar legislation around sexual orientation, around gender, around bullying, toxic workplaces, and sexual harassment. So not only do we have a regulatory obligation as organisations, as leaders, we have an obligation under workplace safety for our employees to ensure that we have psychologically safe workplaces for people and people from neurodiverse and dyslexic backgrounds.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a great conversation because I think it's the tip of the iceberg. And though everyone's at risk of being in a workplace that's not psychologically safe, we know that neurodivergent people are at greater risk when we don't have the right supports, leadership, training, tools, strategies, and environments that help suit our needs. But generally, they're factors that will help create an inclusive environment for everyone. The universal design principles, generally, we'd like to talk about. If everyone gets access to something, then everyone can work in a better way. So I think it's been such a great conversation, and I feel like we need to have a follow up because we didn't even get to touch on when people don't feel safe to disclose and what workplaces could be doing, and when we don't know if someone's neurodivergent but they show some traits, like how do we support them? And I think that would be a really great conversation to have you back on for as well.
I'd be delighted to come back and talk about some of the things that I've observed, the ways in which I've managed people with those backgrounds in and creating psychologically safe work environments, and also talking about structure versus creativity. So, with my neurodiverse background and dyslexia, I need to have a lot of structure, system, and process in place. However, that doesn't necessarily work for people from a creative background. And I work in marketing and branding and work with a lot of creatives. So, how do we find that balance? And you've worked with Dr. Kim Percy in the play, and she comes from a creative background, and we found a way of working really well together. So, I look forward to coming back and talking more about that too.
Yeah, that would be great because we didn't touch on, which was one of my threads in my brain that dropped off, was around as a neurodivergent manager, what do we need to do to make sure that we are not impacting our teams because of the way we work and do things? And I loved when we were working on the project the other week, you said that, sometimes it's flying a plane while you're still building it. And I've just loved that saying so much because I'm not a process person. I just like to sit and create, and then try to bring people around to help me then implement what I'm trying to create and to understand what I'm trying to create. And even though my role for many years was project management, which is all process, but I still got to create things, I think. But yes, so I work very, very differently to you, and so it would be very good. And maybe we could get Kim on, and we could talk about how that works, the three of us in different ways, because we do present differently and
I
just
think
like
that'd be
everyone.
a great conversation, and I
Mm,
feel our audience will really learn a lot from that.
yeah, that would be great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you, everyone, for listening today, because this is a huge topic that we're seeing now that it's become legislated in Queensland. I think, oh, sorry, New South Wales. Victoria's just brought in the legislation. There's a lot of information on the work health safety sites around general psychological safety in the workplace and what that looks like. And again, Google if you need more information around those terms, but also that this is the beginning of a lot of the work that we're starting to do to ensure that neurodivergent people are safe in the workplace. It's what we've been doing for a while now, but now we've got some real frameworks to help us guide some of these conversations in the workplace. So stay tuned. And if you're really interested about this topic, please leave a comment or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and to get your thoughts on this topic as it grows and develops in time. But for now, thank you so much, Ben, for you coming on the show, not for me having been on your show. You can see my brain slowing down. And yes, let's organize that next podcast. That would be awesome. Thank you.
And I would say to everyone out there, check out the website Rethink Dyslexia.
Thanks so much, Ben. And thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening and bye for now.